Hello again at the Centre for Economic Policy Research. We bring you the most important new research on the economic impact of COVID-19. My name is Tim Phillips. Throughout the fight against COVID-19, there have been regular news stories about how female leaders have done a better job at responding to the crisis. Now, is this really true, or is it just a media narrative based on a tiny sample? Luckily, Supriya Garikipati of Liverpool University and Kambhampati at Reading have been looking at the difference that female leaders have made during COVID-19. And they published a paper on it in COVID Economics 26, and they join me today. Supriya, welcome.
Hi, Tim. Thank you.
And welcome as well.
Hi, Tim. Good to be here.
Now, I'm going to start with you because you're responsible for the data here in this conversation. And you had a data set of 194 countries, didn't you? So starting with that, how many of them had female leaders?
Okay, so we started with all the countries that Worldometer provided us with data on, and some fell out because we couldn't find matching data from other sources. We ended up with, as you said, 194 countries, of which 19 countries had female leaders. You know, they were as small as Aruba and St. Martin on the one hand, and Bangladesh and Germany on the other. And of course, went through a range of the Scandinavian countries, as we might expect.
And when you were looking at these countries, what attributes and indicators about them did you compare?
Yeah, so the first thing that we compared was, or we matched by, was the population. Of course, it would be true to say, it's a non-starter to say that the number of cases or deaths in Aruba will be much smaller than in Bangladesh or Germany. So we did match by population. We also matched by the number of people over 65. We've heard a lot of stories during the crisis about elderly population being much more badly affected than younger people. So we included the population above 65. We included urban agglomerations, population in urban agglomerations. Again, for a similar reason, the virus has much greater opportunity to spread when populations are dense. And finally, in the baseline estimation, we included GDP. So GDP was just a measure for prosperity of a country, for the ease with which they would be able to deal with something like a pandemic. So that was the baseline estimations. And then in the extensions, we also included health expenditure. One might expect this is a pandemic, you know, you need hospitals, you need the public health infrastructure. So we included that. We included tourism numbers. Again, I don't know if you cast your mind back to when the UK first had its cases, you know, they said a number of them came as skiers from Europe. And so we thought, well, the more open an economy to travel, foreign travel, the higher the likelihood. And so we included that. And finally, we included the Gender Inequality Index.
Now, we need to talk a little bit about your methodology here, because clearly the sorts of attributes that a country has that might make it choose a female leader might also be things that would be useful in coping with the COVID-19 crisis. So how do you get around that?
Yeah, that's right. That was one of the reasons, or the only reason that we included the Gender Inequality Index. So what the Gender Inequality Index does is to pick up that kind of issue across countries, and it ranks countries as being gender equal or gender not equal, along a range of characteristics of that the UNDP itself picks up. And so we included that because we thought if a country is liberal, progressive as far as gender roles go, then you might expect that it will have a different attitude to things like pandemics and different ways of dealing with it. But even after we included it, our results didn't change. So we were quite heartened by the fact that including that variable didn't make a difference, and at the same time did allow for this issue that you mentioned.
Now, as I understand it, your technique was to pick very similar countries, one of which had a male leader and one of which had a female leader, and compare the outcomes from that. Is that correct?
That's correct. So actually we used a modeling technique that's called nearest neighbor matching. And what it does is it uses these variables that I've just spoken about. And based on these variables, it'll match each female-led country to its nearest neighbor in terms of nearest neighbor, which is a male-led country. And so if in the baseline, it was by population, GDP, urban population, and elderly population. So it would have matched based on that. And then in the extensions, we added more variables to see if it made a difference or not. We also did a matching, not just by the nearest neighbor, but by the nearest 2 countries, the nearest 3, and the nearest 5. And it didn't make a difference to the direction of our results or the significance. Magnitude, of course, does change. And then we decided that we needed to check robustness, because there are some high-profile examples, right? We know the US could shift quite a lot of results. So we dropped the US to see what was happening. We also dropped Germany and New Zealand to see if, these were just outliers that changed the way the sample behaved, and it didn't make a difference to the results.
Well, let's talk about those results. The outcome that everyone's waiting for, did it make a difference?
So our results show very clearly that female-led countries had significantly lower cases and lower deaths. Now, the lower cases is not as significant. So in some estimates, the significance reduces, which tells us that actually for these countries, it wasn't that the virus didn't hit them, and didn't hit them often quite as hard as it did in other countries, but the number of deaths they suffered was significantly less. So in our raw data, for instance, you can see that on average, male-led countries had deaths in the region of 2,000, and female-led countries had deaths in the region of 1,000. So this is a big difference. And even the raw numbers were significantly different. And our results actually confirm that trend, whatever variables so far that we've included to match.
Uma, thank you. Supriya, I'm going to bring you in here. What explains this? What did female leaders do differently?
So the big difference was that female-led countries went into lockdown significantly before male-led countries went into lockdown. So in our results, we find that the total deaths at lockdown in female-led countries are 22 fewer than in male-led countries. So clearly that seems to have made a difference. Female leaders also seem to have been better at communicating the details, engaging more with science, and they seem to have a much more clear-cut strategy without the bravado, unlike many of the male-led countries.
Is this what we often hear about female leadership, more of an emphasis on risk aversion?
Now, when we talk about risk aversion, it really depends on the domain. The domain does matter. So are we talking about saving lives, or are we talking about saving the economy? So it seems that if we are talking about saving lives, then female leaders have certainly been more risk averse than male leaders. But by locking down early, they certainly have taken more of a risk with their economies than male leaders have. So although risk aversion is an important consideration, the domain certainly matters. In fact, there is some interdisciplinary research that supports this idea that domain differences do matter in risk aversion. So to just give you an example, although there is more in the paper about this, neuroscience literature talks about how there are neurobiological underpinnings for the sex differences that we find in feelings of empathy. And these can't all be down to being a cultural byproduct of socialization only. So in other words, females are more empathetic than males. And this kind of starts making sense as to why they locked down their economies earlier to save lives as opposed to saving their economies.
On the other hand,
does matter.
Yeah. On the other hand, Supriya, the small sample of female-led countries, as you've already said, it's a very diverse sample. Can we say these things in general about female leadership when you're talking about someone like Angela Merkel and then someone like Jacinda Ardern, and at very different countries?
Sure, they are, but and this is where the style of leadership matters. So the pandemic has certainly exposed a clear difference in style of leadership between men and women. Female leaders seem to be much more communicative and have adopted a participatory style of leadership when compared to men. In fact, Tim, these differences are not new to the pandemic. They have long existed and they have long been discussed in the leadership literature. So where you find studies systematically show that men adopt more task-oriented type of leadership style, whereas women adopt much more interpersonal styles of leadership. Now, this is not to say that we must succumb to stereotyping male and female leadership. In fact, it's very important to guard against stereotyping. In fact, it's very easy to find examples where women display male management traits, if you like, and vice versa. However, it is equally important to recognize that these gender differences do crop up fairly systematically in studies and in life around us.
One thing that we have seen that a lot of people noticed was Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand doing nightly Facebook Live chats after she put her child to bed, just talking to ordinary New Zealanders. In a crisis, is there evidence that this female leadership traits that you're talking about will make these female leaders better communicators?
I mean, this certainly seems to have been the case, and perhaps the media has played a role in us concluding this. But women leaders seem to have stuck to the core messaging, and they seem to have communicated these well. And like, just to give you some examples, the Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg spoke directly to children, answering their questions. I mean, that can be fairly daunting because children, they can ask you absolutely anything, and you have to be, really clear in communicating with them. And as you mentioned, New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who probably received more media coverage than all the other national leaders put together, was praised quite a lot for a variety of fantastic communication styles that she adopted. And the example that you mentioned strikes a chord with me as well. She checked in with her citizens on a daily basis using Facebook Live. And that's a fantastic example. So here there is actually an interesting study that's worth mentioning that was published in Leadership Quarterly in 2016 that shows that having good communication skills actually is an important determinant of being elected as a female leader. But that's not true for men. And that probably tells you more about why female leaders came across as better communicators in the current pandemic.
Yes, absolutely. Now, your research is from the early stages of the pandemic, the lockdown phase. Now we're going into easing lockdown, rebuilding economies. Do you think that these differences between female and male leadership styles will continue to be important?
I mean, so far they seem to be persisting. At the moment, the top countries for cases are all strong male-led countries. Top of the list is, of course, USA, then comes Brazil, Russia, I'm forgetting, then UK, unfortunately, still there. And then possibly climbing the ladder rapidly is Modi's India. So obviously, these results are persisting even now. Future, we'll have to wait and tell.
And in the future as well, does this tell us very much about female leadership outside of a crisis, because it might increase the demand or the acceptance of female leaders in the future?
One certainly hopes so. But we are stepping into the realm of speculation here. However, if we are to take something from our experience during the pandemic and reflect upon what this tells us in terms of women leaders in general, then we can say that they certainly seem to be bringing new values to leadership that is better aligned with participatory governance. Their style of governance seem to be certainly very different from what the world is used to, right? The poignant point, however, is the real scarcity of female leaders. There are so few of them. And really, Tim, we believe that the challenge here is in overcoming the structures that impede the election of more female leaders. That is the real issue.
Well, there'll be plenty of people watching this today in male-led countries who are thinking they could do with a few more of the qualities that you've been outlining. Supriya, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure.
And Uma, thank you very much as well.
Thank you, Tim.
Now, the paper we've been talking about, please do read it, it's terrific, is Leading the Fight Against the Pandemic. Does Gender Really Matter? Keep in touch with the COVID-19 coverage at Vox EU. There's tons of it, and there's more each time you look. So from Supriya, Uma, and everyone at the CEPR here, see you soon. And as we always say at this point, stay positive by staying negative.